House Targaryen's biggest enemy for 300 years was never the Starks, the Baratheons, or anything beyond the Wall. It was Targaryens. And the numbers get stupid fast. One plague killed a king and the front of his succession. One family war took 20 living dragons down to 4 survivors. Summerhall killed a king, his eldest son, and the Lord Commander of his Kingsguard. For 3 centuries, this family keeps kicking its own family tree and somehow finding another branch underneath it. So how is House Targaryen still here? Start with the Great Spring Sickness, because it gives us the cleanest version of the problem. No dragon, no assassin, no civil war, just disease. King Daeron II dies. So do Princes Valar and Mataris, the 2 men at the front of the line after their father Baelor had already died. And Baelor's death matters, because he had been the celebrated heir everyone expected to become king. Valar only moved to the front after Baelor was killed in a trial of 7. Then, the sickness arrives and removes Valar and Mataris too. In a very short stretch, the family loses the king and the branch that had looked like the obvious future of the crown. But here is the important correction. That did not mean there were only 3 Targaryens left alive. Daeron still had other sons. Aerys, Rhaegal, and Maekar were still there. The dynasty survives because the family tree has backups. Which sounds reassuring until you notice how often those backups have to become the plan. Aerys becomes king. He has no children. His younger brother Rhaegal becomes the next obvious route. Then Rhaegal dies before him, and that branch suffers its own sequence of losses. Eventually, the crown passes to Maekar, another brother who had started much farther from the throne than Baelor ever did. The point is not that the family has only one heir. It is almost the opposite. The family survives because the line keeps rerouting around dead ends. Then Maekar dies, and succession gets messy enough that Westeros calls a great council in 233 AC. The obvious roots have become tangled with dead princes, renounced claims, children, and disputed candidates. The eventual king is Aegon V, Maekar's youngest son, a man so far from the original expectation that he spent part of his youth wandering Westeros as a hedge knight squire. The spare branch does not merely survive, it ends up wearing the crown. That is the first weird Targaryen survival trick. The main branch keeps collapsing, and the backup branch keeps discovering that it is no longer the backup. For most families, a spare prince is insurance. For House Targaryen, spare princes keep getting promoted by emergency, and that would already be enough instability for one dynasty. Unfortunately, the Targaryens also spent generations living next to fire-breathing animals while telling themselves that fire was basically part of the family brand. Take Aerion Brightflame. He decides that drinking wildfire will transform him into a dragon. It does not. It transforms him into a dead prince. That is not genetics. It is not a medical diagnosis. It is a man taking the phrase, blood of the dragon, much too literally. Then comes Summerhall, and Summerhall is where the family turns this problem into architecture. We do not actually know exactly what started the fire. That uncertainty matters. The surviving Maester's account is literally damaged by ink, leaving us fragments. The blood of the dragon gathered, 7 eggs, warnings from a septon, pyromancers, wildfire, flames growing out of control. We know Aegon V had become obsessed with restoring dragons. We know the disaster was connected to that attempt. We do not get to pretend we know which hand struck which spark. The dead include King Aegon V, his eldest son, Duncan the Small, and Sir Duncan the Tall, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. And one detail matters here. Duncan the Small was not the heir anymore. He had given up his claim years earlier to marry Jenny of Oldstones. Aegon's actual heir was his younger son, Jaehaerys, who survived and became king. That makes Summerhall less neat than the version where a king kills his own heir, but honestly, it makes the family tree even stranger. The actual heir is Jaehaerys. His son, Aerys, is part of the next generation. And Aerys' son Rhaegar is being born while the old king and the once heir are dying in the fire. 3 generations of the same dynasty are effectively crossing paths in one burning castle. The king dies. His eldest son, once the heir, dies. The Lord Commander dies. The actual heir survives. And while the castle is burning, a new Targaryen is being born inside it, Rhaegar. House Targaryen does not escape Summerhall, because the fire somehow chooses the correct heir. It escapes because enough different branches are still alive that one disaster, even a terrible one, does not delete the whole tree. But this family has another habit that is much harder to survive. Occasionally the branches start setting each other on fire on purpose. That is the dance of the dragons. I am not interested here in why the succession dispute happened. The only question that matters for this video is what the family managed to destroy once the fighting started. At the end of Viserys I's reign, there were 20 living dragons. By the end of the dance, only 4 were still alive. Cannibal, Sheepstealer, Silverwing, and Morning, which had actually hatched during the war, And even that list is less comforting than it sounds. Cannibal was wild and famously untamable. Sheepstealer disappeared with a rider. Silverwing went feral. Morning was the only young dragon still connected cleanly to the Targaryen court, 20-4. And even that was not the final number. Those 4 did not become the foundation of some grand second dragon age. The survivors vanished from the story one by one, and later, dragons never restore the old population. The small creature remembered as the last Targaryen dragon was not one of the 4 dance survivors at all. She was born later, lived a stunted life, and died in 153 AC. After that, the family that built a continent-sized monarchy with dragons has none. So the dance did not literally reduce the dragons from 20 to 0 in 2 years. That would be a cleaner story, but it would be wrong. What it did was smash the population so badly that the recovery never happened. Roughly a century and a half passes before Daenerys brings dragons back. Think about how bizarre that is. House Targaryen wins Westeros because it has dragons, then spends one family argument destroying almost every dragon it has, and then continues ruling for more than a century without the thing that made the conquest possible in the first place. The family survives its greatest self-inflicted war. Its dragons do not. And now we get to the part that makes the title sound less ridiculous. After enough of these disasters, the Targaryen family tree starts looking less like a tree and more like a relay race. One branch drops the crown, another branch picks it up. The Great Spring Sickness wipes out the front of the succession, so Aerys takes over. Later, the line bends again, and Maekar becomes king. After Maekar, a great council reaches down the family tree and pulls up Aegon V. Summerhall kills Aegon, but Jaehaerys is there to inherit. Rhaegar is born during the same disaster. Again and again, the dynasty does not survive because the obvious heir survives. It survives because somebody else exists. Then Robert's Rebellion finally does what Plague, Wildfire, and Dragons failed to do. It removes House Targaryen from the throne. By the end, the publicly known royal branch in exile is basically Viserys and his newborn sister Daenerys. There is an important footnote. Maester Aemon is still alive at the Wall, but he had long ago become a maester and a brother of the Night's Watch, giving up the normal dynastic path. So for practical purposes, the claim being carried across the narrow sea is in the hands of 2 exiled children. That is not a healthy-looking dynasty. That is a dynasty being carried as hand luggage. And then, roughly 15 years later, Daenerys walks into a funeral pyre with 3 stone eggs, and walks out with 3 living dragons. For about a century and a half, every Targaryen attempt to restore dragons had failed. Some attempts ended badly enough to kill the people trying. Then, one of the last exiled members of the royal branch succeeds, with 3 eggs, everyone treated as dead stone. This is where the obvious counterargument becomes important, because there is a much less magical explanation for Targaryen survival. Maybe they were never as close to extinction as the dramatic moments make them look. The dynasty usually had spare princes, cousins, younger brothers, children, and collateral branches. When the obvious line died, another branch inherited. That is not supernatural luck. That is exactly why royal families produce backups. A medieval dynasty with 6 possible heirs is much harder to erase than one built around a single child. The Targaryens were often reckless, but they were not always demographically fragile in the simple way the title suggests. And yes, that is the strongest objection to this entire video. If the family tree has enough branches, the death of the main branch is a succession crisis, not extinction. That distinction is important, and pretending otherwise would make the title stronger, but the history worse. The Great Spring Sickness proves it perfectly. Daeron, Valar, and Mataris die, but Aerys is right there. Summerhall kills Aegon IV and Duncan, but Jaehaerys survives. Robert's Rebellion leaves Viserys and Daenerys in exile, while Aemon is still physically alive at the Wall even though he is outside the succession. House Targaryen was not literally one heartbeat from extinction every time something went wrong, but that actually gives us the stranger answer. Their survival trick was not being impossible to kill. Targaryens were extremely killable, their dragons were killable, their castles burned, their kings caught plagues, their princes drank wildfire, their civil wars could erase most of their greatest weapons in 2 years. Their real advantage was redundancy, not glamorous redundancy, not dragonfire. Just the deeply uncinematic fact that there was usually another cousin, brother, son, or forgotten branch still breathing somewhere. They kept having a brother nobody expected to rule, a younger branch nobody expected to matter, a prince who had been 4th or 5th in the story, suddenly becoming the story. And when the ruling branch was finally pushed out of Westeros, 2 children were still carried away before the door closed. That does not mean extinction was impossible. Robert's Rebellion shows what happens when the backups finally become children in exile instead of princes waiting in castles. It means the family kept walking right up to the edge, then discovering one more person standing a few steps back from it, which is almost funnier than saying dragons saved them, because dragons clearly did not save them from themselves. The dance proves that. Summerhall proves that. Arion proves that in the most literal possible way. The Targaryens survived because every time the obvious future disappeared, an unobvious future was still available. Aerys after the plague, Maekar after another collapse, Aegon V after a council, Jaehaerys after Summerhall, Viserys and Daenerys after the dynasty itself lost the throne. And then Daenerys somehow brings the dragons back too, because apparently merely surviving was not dramatic enough. So should House Targaryen have gone extinct centuries earlier? As a literal demographic claim, not every crisis was that close. The family had backups, and those backups matter. But as a dynasty that repeatedly kills its front line, burns its own castle, destroys almost all of its dragons, loses its throne, and still manages to leave somebody alive to carry the name forward, the pattern is ridiculous. Maybe the strangest Targaryen superpower wasn't dragons. It was somehow always having one more Targaryen left.